The garage smelled like motor oil and burnt coffee, and on most mornings that was enough. Elara Voss had learned to find comfort in small, reliable things. The weight of a socket wrench fitting perfectly into her palm. The satisfying resistance of a lug nut giving way after 3 hard turns. The way Birch Pruitt always set 2 mugs on the workbench at exactly 7 in the morning without being asked, without saying a word about it, just quietly acknowledging that she was there and that she belonged at least in this small rectangle of fluorescent light and concrete floor in Tacoma, Washington. Outside, April was doing what April always did in the Pacific Northwest. It was raining sideways, the kind of rain that didn't fall so much as materialize, appearing suddenly on every exposed surface, finding the gap between your collar and your neck, soaking through the worn canvas of your work boots before you'd walk 10 steps from the door. Elara didn't mind the rain anymore. She had stopped minding it sometime around January, when minding it had started to feel like a luxury she couldn't afford. She was lying flat on a creeper board underneath a 2003 Ford F-25. Oh! Her flashlight clamped between her teeth, her fingers working at a corroded brake line, fitting that had no intention of cooperating. The truck belonged to a logging contractor named Halverson, who came in every 3 months and always paid in cash and always smelled vaguely of pine resin and cigarettes. She could hear the rain hammering the metal roof of the garage in sheets, and beneath that, from somewhere behind the building where she had parked the Civic, she could hear Cole coughing. It was the kind of cough that had changed over the winter. It had started in December as something sharp and productive, the body fighting hard against something it could still push back. By February, it had become something else entirely. Deeper, wetter. The body was losing ground, and she could hear it in every rattling exhale that reached her through the garage walls. She pulled herself out from under the truck and sat up on the creeper board and listened. The coughing stopped, then it started again. She looked at her hands, black with grease up to the wrists, a thin cut along the pad of her right thumb from where a bracket edge had caught her 3 days ago and hadn't fully healed because cuts didn't heal when your hands were always wet or dirty or both. She had stopped wearing bandages at work because they just absorbed oil and fell off and wasted the last of the first aid tape she'd bought at a dollar store on 6th Avenue. Birch Pruitt appeared in the doorway of the back office holding a mug in each hand. He was 63 years old, built like someone who had spent 4 decades lifting engines out of engine bays with minimal equipment, with white hair cropped short and a face that had been weathered into something permanent and reliable, like old barnwood without sentiment, but not without kindness. He set one of the mugs on the workbench beside the F-250 and looked at her. "He kept you up again," Birch said. "He's fine," Elara said. "He doesn't sound fine. He's better than last week." "Last week I could hear him through the wall of the storage room," Birch said. "That's not a high bar." Elara picked up the mug. The coffee was black and bitter, and she had come to associate the taste of it with a particular kind of morning where you simply had to choose to keep moving because the alternative was sitting down and not getting back up, and sitting down was something she hadn't allowed herself to do since November. Since the night everything ended. She drank half the mug standing up and then went back under the truck. She thought about Cole the way she always thought about him now, which was with a low, constant hum of terror running beneath everything else she did. He had developed the respiratory infection in December, 3 weeks into the kind of winter that the Pacific Northwest delivered without apology, every few years cold that came off Puget Sound in waves and found every crack in the storage room walls, every gap around the single window, every space where the insulation had long ago given up. She had bought him 2 extra blankets from a Goodwill on Pacific Avenue and an electric space heater that Birch had pretended not to notice she'd plugged into the garage's electrical system. She had used the last $200 of her first month's pay at the garage to see a walk-in clinic doctor who had given Cole a course of antibiotics in a look of barely concealed alarm that she had spent the following 2 weeks trying to forget. The antibiotics had helped for a while. Then they had stopped helping as much. She had found a different clinic on 4th Avenue that operated with what she understood to be a flexible approach to certain regulations. And she had started donating plasma twice a week because the plasma center paid $40 for the first donation and $30 for the second. And she had done the math carefully and understood that this was the difference between Cole having medication and Cole not having medication. And so she did it without complaint twice a week, sitting in a vinyl recliner with a needle in the crook of her elbow. Watching daytime television she couldn't hear because she didn't have the earbuds, and reading the captions that were always slightly wrong. This was her life, and she had built it into something survivable, if not something anyone would choose. She had not chosen it. It had been chosen for her on the night of November 12th, 2018, by a man who had once technically been her father. She preferred not to use that word for him anymore. The Merritt family home on Mercer Island sat behind iron gates at the end of a private drive, lined with Japanese maples that in autumn turned the color of arterial blood. From the outside, it looked like something from a magazine about the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because it had never been in a position to need to. 16,000 square feet of glass and Pacific Northwest cedar built into the hillside above the water, with views across Lake Washington that changed every hour depending on the light. Elara had grown up inside those walls and had never once felt at home in them. Douglas Merritt ran Merritt and Holt Logistics, a shipping operation with terminals in Seattle and Long Beach that moved cargo up and down the West Coast and across the Pacific with the kind of efficiency that earned you profile pieces in business journals and invitations to governors' dinners. He was 61 years old, and he had the face of a man who had never once second-guessed a decision he'd made, not because he was always right, but because he had arranged his life in such a way that being wrong never cost him anything visible. He was not a physically cruel man in the ordinary sense of the word. He was precise and he was cold, and he understood that control exercised through financial and psychological pressure left fewer marks than control exercised through other means. He dictated which schools they attended and which friends were acceptable and what they wore to family events and what they were permitted to say in public about the company and the family and himself. He had an opinion about everything, and the opinion was always delivered as fact, and the delivery always carried within it the unspoken suggestion that disagreement would be expensive. Elara had learned early how to move through the house in a way that attracted minimal attention. She was quiet and capable and good at school in the specific ways Douglas approved of mathematics and economics and competitive debate, and she had spent 17 years understanding that her purpose in Douglas Merritt's world was to eventually become a useful piece of his empire. She was designated for the CFO track. There were already conversations happening between Douglas and his board about what her role would look like at 25, at 30, at 40. She had never been asked what she wanted. Cole was different. Cole was gentle and observant and spent every free hour in the greenhouse at the back of the property where Douglas had originally installed hydroponic systems for a business venture that had bored him within 6 months. Cole had converted half the greenhouse into a studio with canvases stacked against the glass walls and brushes standing in old jam jars and the perpetual smell of linseed oil mixing with the damp green smell of the plants. He painted the way some people breathed with a kind of unconscious necessity that had nothing to do with ambition or performance and everything to do with simple need. Douglas had tolerated this through their childhood with the particular patience of a man who assumed the phase would pass. When it didn't pass, when Cole turned 17 and then 18 and showed no signs of developing an interest in logistics or finance or anything that could be monetized within the Merritt organizational structure, Douglas's tolerance curdled into something colder, something that watched and calculated and waited for the right moment to apply pressure. The night of November 12, 2018 was their 18th birthday. Douglas had arranged a dinner, not a celebration in any meaningful sense, but a gathering of board members and family attorneys and 1 or 2 people from the governor's office, the kind of event that was technically about the twins, but was actually about Douglas demonstrating continuity of vision to his stakeholders. The dining room table had been set for 22 people. There were flowers Elara didn't recognize, and wine she wasn't offered, and a cake with the Merritt and Holt Company logo rendered in gold fondant beside their names. It was during the pre-dinner hour when the guests were arranged in the living room with their drinks. that Douglas took Cole into his study and closed the door. Alara was in the hallway. She stood close to the door without quite pressing her ear against it because she had learned over 18 years to read the emotional temperature of a room through a closed door as accurately as most people could read a face. What she heard was Douglas laying out in his usual measured and final way what the next chapter of Cole's life was going to look like. There was a position being created on the Merritt and Holt board, Junior Director of Strategic Development, a title without real authority designed to provide Cole with a credential while keeping him close enough to be managed. Douglas expected him to begin transitioning away from what he called the hobby. He expected this to happen on a timeline he had already determined. There was a silence. Then Cole said quietly and with a steadiness that Alara recognized as the specific courage of someone who has been afraid for a very long time and has finally decided to stop. No. The silence that followed was different from the first one. "I'm not going to do that," Cole said. "I'm going to keep painting." What happened next happened quickly. There was the sound of movement, something that might have been Douglas standing. Then a sharp, flat crack that Alara's body understood before her mind did, because she was already pushing through the door before she had consciously decided to move. Cole was on the floor beside the leather chair, his hand pressed to his face, blood visible between his fingers from where his lip had split against his teeth. Douglas stood over him with an expression that Alara had never seen on him before. Not rage exactly. Something more controlled than rage. Something that had decided. She did not think. She crossed the room in 3 steps and shoved Douglas Merritt with both hands hard, driving him back into the mahogany bookcase behind him. He went sideways into the edge of the glass liquor cabinet instead, and the sound of it shattering brought 2 security guards through the study door within seconds. Douglas straightened. He touched the side of his face where a piece of glass had caught him, looked at the blood on his fingers with something like scientific detachment, and then looked at Alara. "Get them out," he said. His voice was entirely level. "They leave with what's on their backs. If they return to this property, have them arrested." He looked at both of them. Then, and what was in his eyes was not anger or grief or any of the things a father's eyes might hold in a moment like this. There was only the cold arithmetic of a man recalculating an asset as a liability and adjusting accordingly. "You are no longer Merritt's," he said. "You are dead to me." The guards walked them out. It was raining. The iron gates closed behind them with a sound that was entirely mechanical and entirely final. They had no phones, no wallets, no coats. Cole was still pressing his hand against his mouth, the blood from his lip mixing with rainwater and running down his wrist. Alara stood on the wet pavement outside the gate and looked at the lit windows of the house and understood with a clarity that felt like the ground dropping away beneath her that there was no version of the next few hours that involved going back inside. She took Cole's free hand and they walked away from the gate and down the road toward the sound of traffic. The 6 months that followed were an education in the mathematics of survival, which turned out to be very simple mathematics, consisting entirely of the relationship between what you needed to stay alive and what you were willing to do to get it. Birch Pruitt's garage on Meridian Avenue in Tacoma was the 7th place Alara had tried in the first 2 weeks. She had found it the way she had found most things in those early weeks, by walking in and asking directly, and being turned down, and walking out and trying the next one. Birch had been under a Chevy Silverado when she appeared in his bay and asked if he needed help. He had rolled out on his creeper board and looked at her for a long moment. This girl with the split end of a black eye still yellowing at the corner from where she'd been caught by a door in a shelter hallway, in clothes that were clean but had been worn too many consecutive days to look at. He had asked her 2 questions. Could she work a floor jack safely? Did she have anyone she was responsible for? She had answered yes to both. He had told her the pay was $14 an hour, cash, she could park the car around back, and if she broke anything in the shop through carelessness, he would take it out of her wages. Then he had rolled back under the Silverado, and that had been the end of the interview. He never asked about Douglas. He never asked about Mercer Island. In the early weeks, she had expected him to, and the anticipation of the question had been its own kind of exhaustion, bracing for the moment when she would have to decide how much to say and what shape to put it in. But Birch Pruitt operated on a principle she gradually came to understand, which was that people's histories were their own property, and you had no more right to walk in uninvited than you did to open someone's mail. What he did do was teach her things, not formally, not with any announced pedagogical intention. He simply worked beside her and let her watch, and occasionally said things while he was working that were observations about the task at hand, but were also she began to understand something more than that. "A good engine talks to you," he said once, lying on his back under a transmission housing, not looking at her. "You just have to stop thinking long enough to listen. Most people can't do that. They're too busy deciding what they already know." She had been with him 3 weeks at that point, and she hadn't said much, and he hadn't seemed to require it. But she filed that away with the same precision she had once applied to financial modeling in economic theory, because she understood instinctively that it was true about more than engines. She learned to listen to machines the way Birch listened to them. She learned what a worn CV joint sounded like at different speeds, and how to tell from the color of brake dust whether you were looking at organic or semi-metallic pads, and the specific feel in a steering wheel of a tie rod end that was about to fail. She learned that most mechanical problems announced themselves long before they became failures, that the language was there if you paid attention, and that the people who found themselves surprised by a breakdown were almost always the people who had been ignoring what the machine had been telling them for months. She thought about her father sometimes and understood that this was true of more than machines. Cole managed. He had found his way to the Pike Place market area on weekends, where a handful of vendors tolerated artists who set up along the edge of the main arcade, and he did charcoal portraits for $15 each. Quick and accurate likenesses that he produced in under 10 minutes, with a focused intensity that tended to make his subjects feel they were being genuinely seen, which they were, because Cole had always had this quality. This ability to pay complete attention to a person's face in a way that registered without being uncomfortable, and people responded to it even when they didn't know what they were responding to. It wasn't enough money, it was never enough money, but it was his and he had made it, and in those first terrible months that mattered in a way that was hard to quantify. The hardest night was in February. Cole had developed a fever on a Thursday, and by Saturday it was climbing, and the cough had changed into something that Alara could hear in her chest, as well as her ears, a wet, rattling quality that she recognized from enough clinic waiting rooms to know it meant the infection had moved somewhere it shouldn't be. The clinic on 4th Avenue was closed on weekends. The emergency room at Tacoma General would have cost more than she had in the world. She sat in the driver's seat of the Civic with Cole in the back, wrapped in both blankets, and called every number she could think of, which turned out to be very few numbers because they had no phones when they left, and the contacts they had rebuilt were thin. She reached a nurse referral line and described Cole's symptoms, and the nurse asked about his breathing, and Alara described it, and there was a pause on the line that she interpreted correctly. And then the nurse asked if there was a way to get him to an urgent care before morning. She drove 4 miles at 2 in the morning to a 24-hour urgent care on South Tacoma Way that had a sliding scale fee structure for people without insurance. The doctor who saw Cole was young and tired and direct. He said the infection had moved into the lower lung. He gave Cole an injection in a 10-day course of a stronger antibiotic and told Alara that if he didn't improve in 72 hours, she needed to get him to a hospital regardless of the cost. She drove back to the garage at 4 in the morning and sat in the front seat listening to Cole sleep in the back and made calculations in her head about plasma donation schedules and what she could reasonably cut from the minimal expenses she was already carrying. And somewhere in those calculations, she felt something shift inside her that wasn't quite despair, but was adjacent to it. A recognition that she was doing everything right and it might not be enough. Cole improved. The 72 hours passed and the fever broke, and the cough began to change back towards something that sounded like fighting rather than losing. By the end of the 10 days, he was back at the market on weekends. She did not tell him how close she had come to driving him to Tacoma General and walking in and dealing with the financial consequences later. Some things were better carried alone. April arrived and brought its sideways rain, in the sense that winter was releasing its grip in increments grudgingly, like a fist slowly opening. On a Tuesday morning in the third week of April, Two things happened that Alara would spend the rest of her life dividing time by, before and after. She was under the Halverson truck working at the brake line fitting when she heard tires on the wet concrete of the bay entrance that weren't the tires she was expecting. Too quiet. She slid out from under the truck and saw the vehicle before she saw the woman driving it. A Lincoln Town Car, black recent model, with that particular cleanliness that came not from being washed, but from never being near anything dirty. The woman who stepped out of it was somewhere in her early 40s, dressed in a navy suit that fit with the precision of something made specifically for her, rather than selected from a rack. She had dark hair pulled back in the kind of composed, careful face that gave nothing away as a matter of professional habit. She carried a slim leather briefcase and she walked across Birch's oil-stained concrete with the unhurried confidence of someone who understood that environments different from her own were simply different, not threatening. She stopped a few feet from Alara and said, "Alara Voss." Alara was aware of her hands, the grease, the cut on her thumb, the worn work boots. She straightened and said yes. "My name is Sylvia Crane," the woman said. "I'm a probate attorney. I've been retained as a neutral estate administrator in the matter of Edmund Voss." She paused. "Your grandfather?" The name landed in Alara's chest like something physical. Edmund Voss was the family ghost. He was her mother's father, a structural and civil engineer who had built bridges in 3 states before his retirement and who had been, according to everything Alara had ever been allowed to hear about him, something between eccentric and genuinely unwell. Douglas had referred to him as paranoid, unstable, a man who had broken with reality in his later years and retreated to a cabin in the mountains where he had lived out his final years in a kind of voluntary exile from the sensible world. He had died in 2010. Alara had been 9 years old. She had not been taken to the funeral. Douglas had not explained this at the time, and she had learned by then not to ask Douglas to explain things he had not offered to explain. "He passed away in 2010, Alara said. "That's correct," Sylvia said. "However, his will contained a specific codicil with an unusual condition. The materials enclosed in this envelope were to be delivered to you and your brother only upon one of 2 triggering events. The first was either of you reaching your 25th birthday. The second was legal severance from the Merritt family estate." She reached into the briefcase and produced a thick envelope sealed with dark red wax. "The second condition was triggered on November 12th of last year." Birch had appeared in the doorway of the back office. He said nothing. He looked at the Lincoln, looked at Sylvia Crane, looked at Alara. Then he went back inside and left them to it. Alara looked at the envelope. It was cream-colored and heavy. She wiped her hands on a shop rag twice 3 times, getting the worst of the grease off. Then she took it. She broke the wax seal and opened it carefully. Inside was a key, an envelope within the envelope, and a piece of folded paper with GPS coordinates printed in ink. The key was iron. Genuinely iron, not the zinc alloys of modern keys, but the real thing, dark and slightly pitted with age, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its size. It was cut in an irregular pattern along one edge that she didn't recognize as matching any lock type she'd seen in the garage. It was cold in a way that didn't seem entirely explainable by the temperature of the room. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting was precise. The letters formed with the careful deliberateness of someone trained in an era when handwriting was considered a reflection of character. The paper was yellowed at the edges, and the ink had faded to that particular shade of brown-blue that old fountain pen ink became with time. Alara and Cola began. "If you are reading this, it means Douglas has finally shown you who he truly is. I am sorry I could not protect you from him while I was still breathing. They told you I was crazy. They told you I was a paranoid old man who had lost his grip on reality. I needed them to believe that. I spent the last years of my life preparing for the day he would throw you to the wolves because I knew, with the same certainty I knew how to calculate load-bearing tolerances on a suspension bridge, that he would eventually do exactly this. Enclosed are the coordinates to Oak Ridge, my property in the Cascades. Do not take the main roads. Tell no one where you are going. What is inside will not make sense to you at first, but it will save your lives. All I ask is that you be brave enough to go and see. The key will open what needs opening. Trust the work. It holds. Your grandfather, Edmund. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in her hand and stood very still in the middle of Birch Pruitt's garage for a moment that felt longer than it was. Birch was standing in the doorway again. He had 2 fresh mugs of coffee. He set one on the workbench and looked at her the way he looked at a mechanical problem that had just revealed itself to be more complicated than it first appeared. "You need the afternoon," he said, and went back inside before she could answer. She went to the Civic and knocked twice on the rear window. Cole opened his eyes. She held up the iron key through the glass so he could see it. His expression changed in a way she didn't have a word for. They stopped for a full tank of gas and 2 cans of bear mace at a station on the edge of Tacoma, and then they drove east toward the mountains. The Cascades rose ahead of them through the rain, their upper elevations lost in cloud. The highway climbed in long curves through stands of Douglas fir that grew denser and taller. As the elevation increased, the kind of trees that had been standing in the spot for a century or more and had no particular investment in the events of human history playing out at their feet. The GPS on the cracked dashboard screen guided them for the first 2 hours before the signal began to fragment and then disappear entirely, leaving them with the coordinates printed on Edmund's paper and a topographical map Alara had bought at a gas station outside North Bend, spreading it across the steering wheel and navigating by elevation lines and creek names while Cole held the flashlight and called out road numbers. The road became gravel. The gravel became dirt. The dirt became ruts filled with standing water that the Civic navigated with increasing protest, its suspension bottoming out twice in deep holes that had been invisible under the surface of the puddle. The road ended at a rusted chain-link gate with a faded sign. Private property. Trespassers will be met with force. Alara killed the engine. The silence was immediate and total, the particular silence of old-growth forest, where even the rain was filtered and muffled by the canopy overhead into something close to stillness. "You sure about this?" Cole said. "We have nothing left to lose," she said. She meant it not as bravado, but as literal assessment. She had learned in 6 months to be honest about her actual position. They climbed the gate and walked the remaining half-mile on foot through the trees. The air was cold and close, smelling of wet bark and decomposing needles and something mineral she couldn't identify. The path, if it had ever been one, was barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. Then they came over a low ridge and Oak Ridge came into view. It stopped her. Not because it was beautiful, because it was wrong. Wrong in the way that a thing is wrong when it doesn't match its context, when your expectations have been built around one reality and you are confronted with another. The name had suggested a cabin, something modest, an old man's retreat. This was not that. The structure that sat in the shallow depression below them was built from reinforced concrete in a way that declared its purpose without decoration. The foundation was thick and brutalist, extending further into the ground than the visible wall suggested. The windows, all 4 of them, were sealed not with boards, but with 1/4-inch steel plate bolted directly into the concrete frame with hardware that had been designed to stay. The roof was covered so completely in moss and accumulated pine debris that from any elevation above, it would have been invisible, indistinguishable from the forest floor. This was not a retreat. This was a fortification. They went down the ridge and stood before the door. It was solid oak, iron-banded, with no visible knob or handle, only a massive deadbolt with a keyhole cut to match the irregular key in Alara's hand. She fit the key into the lock. It required both hands and her full weight leaning into the turn. There was resistance that felt mechanical rather than simply physical, as though something was being disengaged rather than merely rotated. Then a sound deep and deliberate, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be released. The door opened. The air that came out of it was cold in a different way from the outside cold. Drier, older, carrying within it the particular scent of a sealed space metal and paper and time laid down in layers. Alara clicked on her flashlight and stepped inside. The beam swept through the darkness and found the interior of Oak Ridge one detail at a time. A leather armchair beside a cold stone fireplace. Its surface cracked along the armrest in the specific pattern of something that had been sat in thousands of times over decades. A wooden dining table with a single ceramic mug still sitting on it, the coffee inside long since evaporated to a dark ring at the bottom. A pair of reading glasses folded on top of an open book, a structural engineering manual from the early 1990s, its pages splayed at a chapter on load distribution and underground construction. Bookshelves covering two full walls packed with engineering texts and history books, and philosophy, the spines arranged with the same careful precision as the handwriting in Edmund's letter. Everything was frozen, not abandoned, frozen. There was a difference that Alara felt before she could articulate it. Abandoned spaces had a quality of disorder of things left mid-thought. This room had the quality of a place where a person had lived completely and then simply stopped where the last morning had been an ordinary morning, and the man who had poured that coffee and set down those glasses had not known it was the last one. She found a kerosene lantern on a shelf near the door still full. She lit it with a match from the box beside it, and the warm orange glow expanded through the room, softening the shadows and revealing more. Cole stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking it in. His face had the particular focused stillness it got when he was looking at something he was trying to understand before he spoke about it. He lived here, Cole said. Until 2010, Ilara said. This isn't how a crazy person lives, Cole said quietly. He was right. The room had the organization of a disciplined mind. Every object had a place and appeared to be in it. The bookshelves were arranged by subject and then by date. The engineering manuals were annotated. She could see the pencil markings in the margins from where she stood, careful and small and consistent. On one wall framed was a technical drawing of a suspension bridge, the lines precise as surgery, with Edmund Voss P.E. printed in the title block at the lower right corner. This was not a man who had lost his grip on reality. This was a man who had wanted people to believe he had. Alara moved deeper into the room holding the lantern. The floorboards were heavy old-growth fir, solid and barely flexing underfoot. The dust on the surface was even and undisturbed except for their own footprints moving in from the door. Except in one place. She almost missed it. The lantern light caught it at an angle, the way light reveals the difference between what is flat and what is not quite flat when it falls across a surface at low degrees. Near the right side of the fireplace, the dust on the floor was disturbed, not by footprints, by a sweep pattern, a clean arc in the dust, as though something had moved across the floor in a quarter circle, displacing the settled years of fine gray dust into a curved line that began at the base of the right side of the hearth and swung out toward the center of the room. She crouched down and looked at the arc more carefully. The radius was consistent. Whatever had made the mark had moved in a precise geometric path along a fixed point. She looked at the fireplace. It was stone floor to ceiling, built from river rock, mortared together with craftsmanship that belonged to an earlier era of construction. Massive, wide enough to take 4-foot logs, and deep enough that a fire inside it would have been 3 feet from the front edge of the hearth. The mantelpiece was a single beam of old fir, dark with age. She pressed her hand flat against the stone on the right side, moving methodically upward, feeling for anything that didn't belong. The rock was cold and rough under her palm, the mortar between the stones dry and granular. Then at shoulder height, her thumb pressed against something that was neither rock nor mortar. She pressed harder. The surface was smooth and slightly yielding, and beneath the paint and texture applied to its surface, she could feel the seam of a machined edge. Steel, painted and textured to read as stone in the low light, but steel. She looked at Cole. He had crossed the room and was standing beside her watching. She pressed the panel inward with her full thumb. The sound that followed came from everywhere at once. A deep hydraulic exhale from within the walls, the displacement of pressure in sealed chambers, followed by a low mechanical groan that traveled through the concrete foundation and up through the floorboards and into the soles of their feet. The massive stone fireplace shifted. It moved on a hinge set deep in the left foundation wall, swinging forward, and to the right, the base of it, riding on rollers buried in a track beneath the floor. The movement was slow and deliberate, an entirely controlled opening like a vault door being swung wide by its own counterweight system, revealing behind it a narrow concrete stairwell descending into absolute darkness. The air that rose from below was cold and dry and carried a smell that Alara recognized from the garage. The specific smell of enclosed metal and electrical components and old paper kept in controlled conditions. Someone had built a system to manage the air down there. Edmund had built a system. A real one engineered to specification because he was a man who knew how to engineer things to specification. She held the lantern over the top of the stairwell. The light reached the first 6 or 7 steps and then gave out against the darkness below. "Stay behind me," she said to Cole. She counted 20 steps going down. The walls were poured concrete smooth and undecorated, the work of someone who understood that this space was not meant to be comfortable, but to be functional and permanent. The temperature dropped with each step. By the time she reached the bottom, she could see her breath in the lantern light. She raised the light and looked at what Edmund Voss had spent 11 years building. The room was roughly 30 feet by 20, with an 8-foot ceiling of reinforced concrete supported by 4 steel columns set in a grid pattern. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling in corkboard panels, and the corkboard was covered in materials attached with pins and organized in a system that took her several seconds to begin to read. Photographs, hundreds of them, black and white, in color, some clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a significant distance, and some that must have required proximity she didn't want to think about. Men in suits at car doors, ships at dock, cargo containers being transferred to flatbed trucks in what she recognized as the Long Beach terminal based on the signage visible in the background. Men shaking hands in restaurant parking lots and hotel lobbies, and in several cases, in what appeared to be private aircraft. Between the photographs pinned in careful sequence were documents, shipping manifests with line items circled in red pen, bank statements with account numbers highlighted and routing codes traced to notations in the margins, a series of hand-drawn diagrams showing cargo flow through the Seattle terminal with certain containers marked with a small asterisk in a circle. Red string connected the photographs to the documents, to the diagrams, and then to a series of index cards written in Edmund's precise handwriting, each one representing a node in a network that spanned as far as she could read in the lantern light from Seattle, down the coast to Long Beach, and then out across multiple points in Eastern Europe. In the center of the room stood a steel safe, a Mosler, the classic commercial type built in American factories in the middle of the last century, with a reputation for being essentially indestructible. On top of the safe sat a black leather ledger. Ilara crossed the room and picked up the ledger. It was heavy. She opened it to the first page. The date at the top was July 14th, 1999. The handwriting was Edmund's. Douglas Merritt is not a businessman. He is a criminal who has constructed a businessman's identity as protective camouflage. What follows is the documented record of more than 2 decades of systematic criminal enterprise conducted through Merritt and Holt Logistics. The operation uses legitimate cargo shipping as infrastructure for the movement of military-grade weapons to purchasing parties in Eastern Europe, concealed within agricultural commodity shipments classified as grain, timber byproducts, and processed food materials. The financial flows pass through a layered system of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus before returning as clean capital to Merritt and Holt's legitimate operations. I have been gathering this evidence since 1999. I have done so alone because the scale of Douglas Merritt's institutional influence in Seattle makes involving local law enforcement or state-level investigators an unacceptable risk. The evidence in this room is intended for federal investigators with the insulation and authority to act on it without being neutralized by the networks Douglas has purchased over 2 decades. If my grandchildren are reading this, it means Douglas has finally done what I always knew he would do. It means you have found what I left for you, and it means the time has come. She stopped reading. Cole had come to stand beside her. She could hear his breathing, careful and controlled. She turned the pages slowly. The ledger was chronological dated entries spanning from 1999 to what appeared to be late 2009, a year before Edmund's death. Each entry was specific: dates, vessel names, container identification numbers, the weights and classifications declared on legitimate manifests versus the notations Edmund had gathered through sources she couldn't fully identify, but which appeared to include at least one person inside the Long Beach terminal operations. Toward the back, the entries changed in character. They became less observational and more predictive. Edmund writing about what he believed Douglas would do once Edmund was no longer present to monitor and document. He had written in an entry dated October 2009 that the elimination of dock workers who had raised questions internally about certain container weights was something Douglas was capable of ordering, that he had seen evidence of previous instances, and that he expected this to happen within 2 years of Edmund's death. The dock workers had been killed in 2011. Edmund had been dead for a year by then. He had seen it coming and had written it down and had not been able to stop it because he had been running out of time and he had known it. She closed the ledger. She stood in the underground room her grandfather had built with his own hands, surrounded by 11 years of solitary, meticulous, dangerous work, and she felt something settle into place inside her that she didn't have a clean word for. Not anger, though. Anger was part of it. Not grief, though that was part of it too. Something more structural, a sense of understanding what she was now standing under and what was required to hold it. Then a sound from above stopped everything. A footstep, one clear and deliberate on the floorboards of the cabin above their heads. Then another. Alara clicked off the flashlight. The darkness was total. Beside her, she felt Cole go completely still, felt him reach out and find her arm in the blackness and hold it. She did not breathe. The footsteps above moved with a pace that was not exploratory. Whoever was walking knew where they were going. The steps crossed the room above them, paused, and then began descending. A light appeared at the top of the stairwell. Tactical, bright, the kind of focus beam held with professional steadiness. A voice came down the stairs with it. "Ilara, Cole." Sylvia Crane's voice was entirely unhurried. "You don't need to hide in the dark. Come out and we can have a conversation like adults." The light reached the bottom of the stairs and swept the room until it found them standing against the far wall beside the Mosler safe, Alara in front, with Cole behind her shoulder. Sylvia descended the last 3 steps and stopped at the base of the stairwell. She had changed from the navy suit. She was wearing dark clothing, now practical, and in her right hand, held at a downward angle that communicated both readiness and control, was a Glock 19 with a suppressor threaded onto the barrel. She was not playing the probate attorney anymore. "You made very good time." Sylvia said, her flashlight beam moving to the ledger in Alara's hands and stopping there. "Your grandfather built the triggering mechanism in the will with real elegance. The coordinates would only release upon legal severance from the Merritt estate. Douglas had to actually disown you to activate the map. He had to use his own cruelty as the key." She took one step into the room. He didn't enjoy it for what it's worth. Douglas isn't a man who likes waste. But Edmund left him no choice, and Edmund knew that and built the whole system around it. The old man was genuinely brilliant. She paused. He was also genuinely dangerous, which is why we've been looking for this room for 9 years. Ilara's hand tightened on the ledger. "You work for Douglas." "I have worked for Douglas for 14 years, Sylvia said. "The neutral estate administrator presentation is something we prepared 8 years ago against the day the codicil activated. We needed someone Edmund's estate attorneys would accept, and someone who could follow you here without arousing concern." She extended her left hand, palm up. "Slide the ledger across the floor, Alara, then step away from the safe." "And then what?" Cole said from behind Alara's shoulder. Sylvia's silence was the answer. It was the particular silence of someone who has decided that the people in front of them are a problem with a solution, and the solution is not a conversation. They were 20 steps underground in a concrete room with one exit. The exit was behind Sylvia Crane. There were no windows, no secondary doors, no tools within reach that Alara could identify in the darkness, except for the lantern she had set on the floor when she opened the ledger currently extinguished 3 feet to her left. Her right hand was in her jacket pocket. The bear mace canister was there. She had put it in before they left the car because she had lived 6 months in a state of low-grade alertness and had developed the habit of keeping it accessible. The canister was 4 inches long and could deliver a pressurized cloud of capsaicin at a range of up to 12 feet. Sylvia was 8 feet away. Alara's thumb found the safety cap on the canister and clicked it off. The sound was small. She was counting on the ambient noise of their breathing and Sylvia's own focused attention on the ledger to cover it. "Slide it across," Sylvia said again and took another step. Alara said, "Cole, down." She pulled the canister from her pocket, extended her arm, and held the trigger down. The spray hit Sylvia Crane full in the face from 6 feet. The reaction was immediate and total, the capsaicin compound making direct contact with eyes and mucous membranes and triggering the body's complete crisis response. Sylvia screamed a raw sound that had nothing of the composed attorney left in it, and her hands spasmed on the Glock. The suppressed shot was still loud in the concrete room, a flat mechanical bark that sent the bullet into the wall 6 inches from Alara's left shoulder, throwing chips of concrete that stung the side of her neck. She drove forward and to the left, out of the line of the weapon, as Sylvia swung it blindly in the direction of the sound. Cole moved. In the darkness, with no flashlight and no warning, he had taken 2 steps to his right, while Alara fired the mace, putting himself in a position that Sylvia had not tracked. He had picked up the cast-iron bookend from Edmund's reading desk, a heavy rectangular block that had been sitting beside the engineering manual, and he swung it in a controlled arc that caught Sylvia across the back of the skull with the kind of impact that does not leave room for anything else. Sylvia Crane folded onto the concrete floor. The tactical flashlight rolled away from her hand and came to rest against the base of one of the steel columns, throwing its beams sideways across the room at floor level, illuminating everything in long, flat shadows. Alara stood still for 3 seconds with the bear mace canister still in her hand and her heart doing something loud and irregular in her chest. Then she crossed to Sylvia, crouched down, and checked for consciousness. The woman was breathing. The wound on the back of her head was bleeding, but not at a rate that alarmed her. She looked up at Cole. He was standing with the bookend still in his hand, breathing hard, looking at Sylvia with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not horror exactly, but the face of someone who has just discovered something about themselves they weren't sure of before. "You okay?" she said. "Yes," he said. He set the bookend down carefully. They used the belt from Sylvia's tactical jacket and the laces from her boots to secure her wrists and ankles. Alara stripped the Glock from her hand, checked the chamber, engaged the safety, and put it in her own jacket pocket. She took Sylvia's phone and the keys to the Lincoln. Then she turned back to the Mosler safe. The letter had mentioned bearer bonds, but the safe required a combination, and there was no combination written anywhere in Edmund's letter. She stood in front of the brass dial and thought about what Edmund had said. Trust the work. It holds. And then she thought about something else, about what Birch had told her once about machines, about how a person's choices accumulated over time told you everything about what they valued. Edmund had never missed a birthday. Cole had mentioned it in the car almost as an aside, a small remembered fact that even when Douglas had forbidden contact, when Edmund had been banished from the house and declared unstable, a small package had arrived each year through an intermediary. Left with Birch at the garage, Edmund had visited in 2009, passed along through a chain that had kept Douglas from seeing it. Never a card with a name, but always on the date. The date. November 12th. Their birthday. 11/12. The year they turned 18. 2018. She stepped up to the dial and set her right hand on it. Right to 11, left to 12, right to 18. She gripped the handle and pulled. The locking mechanism released with a sound that was deep and deliberate and final, the sound of something that had been designed to hold until exactly this moment and was now having held for as long as it needed to letting go. The door swung open. Inside, on 3 shelves stacked in vacuum-sealed clear plastic packages, were bundles of bearer bonds in high denominations. She didn't count them. She didn't need to yet. but it was the top shelf that stopped her breath. Three black external hard drives, each labeled in Edmund's handwriting, with dates spanning 2004 to 2009. A stack of original shipping manifests signed with the Merritt and Holt Company seal. Six audio cassette tapes labeled with dates and locations and names she recognized from the corkboard above, and a small white envelope sealed with two words written on the front, for Ilara. She picked it up and held it. Below her on the floor, Sylvia Crane made a sound and moved slightly. Ilara looked at her, verified the restraints were holding, and looked back at the envelope. She put it in her inside jacket pocket. She wasn't going to read it in a concrete bunker with an unconscious woman on the floor. She was going to read it when she was ready. They packed everything from the safe into Sylvia's leather briefcase. The ledger, the hard drives, the manifests, the tapes, the bonds. The briefcase was designed for documents and a laptop, and it took some rearranging, but everything fit. Ilara locked the safe and left it locked. She looked at Sylvia one more time. The woman was breathing steadily, and the bleeding from the scalp wound had slowed. She had been responsible for tracking two teenagers into a mountain bunker with the intention of killing them and taking their grandfather's life's work. And she was going to have a significant headache when she woke up, and Ilara found that she felt entirely at peace with this outcome. They climbed the 20 steps back to the cabin. Ilara found the hydraulic release for the fireplace from the inside, a steel lever set into the wall beside the stairwell entrance, and closed it behind them. The fireplace ground back into its closed position. She locked the cabin door from the outside with Edmund's iron key. They drove the Lincoln south. The road out of the mountains was easier in the larger vehicle, the suspension handling the ruts without complaint, the headlights reaching further into the dark. Cole sat in the passenger seat with the briefcase on his lap, looking out the window at the trees moving past in the headlight wash. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he knew exactly what Douglas would do. Yes, Ilara said. He built the whole thing around it. Cole turned the thought over carefully. He used Douglas's own nature as the mechanism. Douglas couldn't stop himself from being what he was, and Edmund turned that into the trigger. Edmund was an engineer, Ilara said. He calculated load tolerances. Cole was quiet again. Then softly, he knew we'd make it down here. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The answer was the briefcase on Cole's lap and the iron key in her jacket pocket, and the fact that they were driving away from the mountain in the car of the woman who had been sent to stop them. They reached Portland 3 hours later. The city came up through the rain in bands of orange streetlight and wet pavement reflection. Ilara found an all-night pharmacy and bought gauze and antiseptic for Cole's hands. She bought food from a gas station, and they sat in the Lincoln in the parking lot and ate in silence. She found a private medical clinic operating from a converted Victorian on the east side, the kind of practice that had a discreet online presence and a payment structure that didn't ask about insurance. She walked in at 11 at night and set enough cash on the desk to cover 3 days of treatment. The doctor who examined Cole was thorough and unhurried, and had the manner of someone who had seen most things and did not require explanations for any of them. He confirmed the lower respiratory infection, prescribed an intravenous antibiotic course, and arranged for Cole to be admitted to a private room for 72 hours of treatment. Cole protested from the examination table. "We don't have time for 72 hours. "We have time," Ilara said. "Douglas is going to figure out that Sylvia hasn't reported in. Sylvia is locked in a concrete room 20 steps underground in the middle of the Cascade Mountain Range," Ilara said. "Douglas is going to have a hard time figuring out anything from her for a while. You're getting the antibiotics." Cole looked at her for a moment and then lay back on the examination table. While Cole slept through the first night of IV treatment, Ilara sat in the leather chair beside his bed, with the briefcase open on the small writing desk, and worked through Edmund's materials methodically, beginning with the earliest dated documents and moving forward through time. It took most of the night. The scope of what Douglas had built was larger than she had grasped from the ledger entries. The hard drives, which she accessed through a burner laptop she had bought at a pawn shop on the way in, contained encrypted files that Edmund had clearly obtained through sources with direct access to Merritt and Holt's internal systems, routing information, internal communications, financial modeling documents that showed how the legitimate logistics operation was structured to absorb and launder proceeds from the weapons trafficking at a level that had apparently satisfied multiple rounds of standard federal financial review. There were names, customs agents, port inspectors, a state-level official whose name she recognized from news coverage, all with corresponding payment records, amounts, dates, delivery mechanisms. And there were the dock workers. Roy Kellerman and James Prudhomme, both Long Beach terminal employees, both dead in June 2011, both deaths attributed in official records to unrelated causes. Edmund had documented the internal Merritt and Holt communications that preceded their deaths. Communications that referred to them only by employee ID numbers and described what was going to happen to them in language that was deliberately oblique, but not oblique enough to misread. She had to stop reading at 4 in the morning and stand at the window of Cole's room and breathe for a while. On the second day, she opened the envelope. For Alara. She sat in the chair beside Cole's sleeping form, the IV drip running its quiet cadence, and she opened the envelope with the same careful deliberateness she had come to associate with everything Edmund had left. The letter inside was shorter than the first one, written on a single sheet of the same yellowed paper in the same fountain pen ink, now more faded at the edges. Alara, it said, what you have found in this room is a weapon, but a weapon is only as effective as the hand that wields it, and the hand must know exactly where to strike. There is one thing remaining that you will need, a man named Roy Callum. He is 71 years old, and he has been living quietly in Eugene, Oregon for 11 years. He was the supervising manager of the Long Beach Terminal Cargo Division from 2004 to 2009. He saw what happened. He was afraid, and his fear was reasonable, because what he saw was the kind of thing that gets people killed. And in 2011, it did get people killed. I found Roy in 2008. I told him that someone would come eventually who could make the thing he saw matter. I gave him a place to be safe, and I told him to wait. He has been waiting for 11 years. He will not speak to anyone except the person carrying the iron key. That was our agreement. He has what you need to close the last gap in the evidence. Go to him first before you go anywhere else. The address is below. And Alara, one more thing. I know what these years cost you. I know what it cost your brother. The packages every year were not nothing. They were the only way I had to tell you that I had not forgotten and that I was still there, and that what was coming was worth waiting for. What I built was built to last. You are the proof of that. Edmund. She folded the letter along its creases and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she looked at the address written at the bottom of the page. Eugene, Oregon. Roy Callum had been waiting 11 years. She looked at Cole, sleeping in the hospital bed, his breathing easier than it had been in months, the IV line running its slow, reliable work, and she thought about Edmund alone in the cabin running his calculations, documenting his evidence, building the mechanism that would outlast him, trusting that the two children, whose photographs he had sealed into the concrete of a stairwell, would eventually come down the stairs and find what he had left. She thought about the iron key in her jacket pocket, its weight, its coldness, the way it had required both hands and her full strength to turn but had turned. She looked at the address again. Eugene was 2 hours south. Cole was discharged on the morning of the third day with a prescription for 2 more weeks of oral antibiotics and instructions to rest that Alara acknowledged and fully intended to partially ignore. He looked better than he had in months. The color had come back into his face, and his breathing had the quality of something that had been properly repaired, the difference between a structural fix and a temporary workaround. And she noted this the way she noted mechanical improvements and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since December. They drove south on I-5 with the Lincoln's heater running and the rain following them down the valley. The Willamette spread out to their right in the gray morning light, wide and flat, and moving with the patient indifference of a river that had been doing this long before anyone had built a highway beside it. Eugene came up through the mist 2 hours later. The address Edmund had written led them off the interstate and through a series of residential streets that grew quieter and more modest, with each turn the kind of neighborhood built in the 1970s that had settled into itself since then. Without drama, the house is small and well-maintained and set back from the street behind established hedges and old maple trees, whose roots had long since won their argument with the sidewalk. The house at the end of the address was a single-story ranch with pale yellow siding and a covered front porch. A light was on inside behind closed curtains. The driveway held a 10-year-old Subaru with Oregon plates. The front walk had been swept recently despite the wet weather. Someone was home and someone was careful. Alara parked the Lincoln 2 houses down and considered the approach. Roy Callum had been living in hiding for 11 years. He had agreed to speak only to the person carrying Edmund's key. Appearing at his front door unannounced in the vehicle of the woman who had tried to kill them in a mountain bunker was not the most reassuring possible entrance. She got out of the car and walked to the front door alone, leaving Cole in the passenger seat. She knocked twice. The silence inside the house changed quality. She had learned in the past 6 months to read silences to distinguish between the silence of an empty space and the silence of a person holding still. And this was the second kind. She said through the door, "My name is Alara Voss. Edmund Voss was my grandfather. He sent me." A pause. Then the sound of a deadbolt, and then a second one, and then a chain. The man who opened the door was 71 years old and had the look of someone who had been afraid for a very long time and had learned to organize his life around that fear so completely that the fear had become structural, the thing that held the rest of the routine together. He was medium height with white hair cut close to the skull and a face that had once been broader, the kind of face that contracts inward over years of vigilance. His hands gripping the edge of the door had the thick-knuckled look of someone who had worked with them for decades. He looked at her face for a long moment. Then his eyes went to her jacket pocket. She reached in and took out the iron key and held it in her palm between them. Roy Callum's face did something she hadn't expected. His eyes filled. Not dramatically, not with open weeping, but with the slow, quiet filling of someone who has been holding something for 11 years and has just been told they can put it down. He stepped back from the door and let her in. The interior of the house was clean and spare in the way of a person who had reduced their possessions to what was necessary and then stopped there. A couch, a chair, a kitchen table with 2 placemats on it, despite living alone, a habit from a previous life that had persisted. On the wall above the table was a single-frame photograph, a shipping terminal at dawn, the cranes rising against a pale sky, the kind of photograph a person kept because it represented something they had once been. She brought Cole in from the car, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Roy Callum made coffee without being asked, moving around his small kitchen with the efficiency of someone who needed to do something with his hands while he organized his thoughts. He set the mugs on the table and sat down across from them and looked at the iron key Alara had placed between them. "He told me you'd come," Roy said. His voice was careful, the voice of someone who had been selective about speaking for a long time. "He said it would take as long as it took. He said I should stay put and stay quiet and wait. He said the two of you would either make it or you wouldn't. And if you made it, you'd find the room. And if you found the room, you'd find the letter. And if you found the letter, you'd come here." "When did you last hear from him?" Cole asked. 2009, Roy said. "He drove down himself, showed up at the terminal where I was working, waited in the parking lot until my shift ended. Said he was running out of time. Said the evidence he'd compiled was almost complete, but there was one thing still missing. One thing he couldn't document from the outside, and I was the only one who could provide it." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "I told him I couldn't. I told him I had a family. I told him I'd seen what Douglas did to people who tried to stand up, and I wasn't willing to be next." He was quiet for a moment. Edmund listened to all of it, didn't argue with any of it. Then he said, "You don't have to do anything now. I'm going to set up a life for you somewhere quiet. New name, new address, enough money to stay comfortable. All you have to do is hold on to what you saw and wait for the right people to come and ask for it." "He moved you here," Alara said. 6 months later, Roy said. "Roy Callum isn't the name I was born with, but it's the name I've had long enough now that it fits." He looked at the iron key again. He said the key would come eventually. He said to trust it. "What did you see?" Alara said. Roy Callum was quiet for a long moment. The rain moved across the roof of the small house in waves. The refrigerator made its periodic mechanical sound. Cole sat very still beside her. Then Roy reached under the table and produced a metal document box that had been sitting on the chair beside him, positioned where she couldn't have seen it from the door. He set it on the table and unlocked it with a key from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a USB drive in a manila envelope. The summer of 2007, Roy said, I was managing the overnight receiving operations at Long Beach. We had a series of containers come through on a Tuesday night manifest that didn't match the weight certifications. Agricultural commodity containers are supposed to run between 18 and 22,000 pounds for a standard load. These were running 30 to 34. I flagged it in the system. My supervisor called me at home that night and told me the discrepancy had been reviewed and resolved at the corporate level, and I should update my records accordingly. He opened the manila envelope and spread several printed photographs on the table. Dock photographs, timestamps showing containers being offloaded not into the standard receiving area, but into a segregated staging zone outside the normal camera coverage. I was stubborn enough to keep watching, Roy said. Not because I was brave, because I couldn't make the numbers work, and it bothered me the way a bad ledger bothers an accountant. 2 weeks later, I was on a late shift and I saw Douglas Merritt himself at the terminal. At 2 in the morning, with two men I didn't recognize, and a port inspector I knew by name. He tapped the USB drive. I had a small camera. I'd been documenting some safety violations in the yard that I was planning to report through internal channels. I used it. He paused. What's on that drive is Douglas Merritt directing a transfer operation for those containers. You can see his face clearly. You can hear him partially because I was close enough. And you can hear him refer specifically to the manifest discrepancy I had flagged and tell the inspector that the flagging needed to disappear from the system going forward and that the inspector would be compensated for the additional oversight responsibilities. He slid the drive across the table toward Alara. I went to Edmund because I didn't know who else to go to. He was the only person I'd ever heard of who had been watching Douglas long enough to have context for what I had. I found him through a port worker in Seattle who said there was an old engineer who'd been asking quiet questions about Merritt and Holt for years. Roy's hands closed around his empty mug. Edmund told me what I had was the piece that connected Douglas directly to the operation face and voice on record. Everything else he had documented was transactional paper trails, financial flows. But paper trails can be attributed to subordinates. A man standing in a terminal at 2 in the morning directing a weapons transfer cannot. Alara picked up the USB drive and turned it in her fingers. 11 years this man had been waiting in a house in Eugene with 2 placemats on his table and a photograph of cranes on his wall holding this thing because Edmund Voss had asked him to trust that the right people would eventually come. She looked at Roy Callum across the table. The notarized statement, she said. Edmund mentioned you'd have a statement. Roy opened the manila envelope further and produced a document multiple pages witnessed and notarized dated 2009. A full account of what Roy had seen in the specific sequential language of a formal witness declaration signed and sealed with enough legal formality to survive chain of custody challenges in a federal proceeding. She read the first page and then looked up. Thank you, she said. Roy Callum shook his head slightly. I should have done it sooner. Those 2 men in 2011 would still be alive if I'd found a way to do it sooner. You didn't have Edmund's evidence then, Cole said quietly. What you had alone wasn't enough to protect you, and it wasn't enough to hold in court. Edmund needed both. Roy looked at Cole with the expression of someone receiving something they hadn't expected from a direction they hadn't anticipated. Your grandfather talked about you both, Roy said. He said Alara would figure out the mechanism and Cole would figure out the meaning. He almost smiled. He said that was why it had to be both of you. They left Eugene an hour later with the USB drive and the notarized statement added to the briefcase. Alara drove north on I-5 with the rain finally easing and the late afternoon light finding gaps in the cloud cover and falling across the highway in long moving columns that shifted as the clouds moved. She called Agent Doran Kell from a burner phone outside Salem. She had found Kell's name in Edmund's ledger near the back, circled 3 times with the notation, honest. Has been working the 2011 dock worker deaths without traction. Needs the final mechanism. She had cross-referenced him against the FBI Seattle field office directory on the clinic's laptop and confirmed he was still assigned to the Financial Crimes Division and had been for 11 years. The field office line picked up on the second ring. She asked for Kell by name and was put on hold for 40 seconds. When he came on the line, his voice was direct and tired, and carrying within it the specific weariness of someone who had been working a case that kept hitting walls and had not yet made peace with stopping. She said, "My name is Alara Voss. My grandfather was Edmund Voss. He spent 11 years documenting the criminal operations of Douglas Merritt of Merritt and Holt Logistics in Seattle. Edmund died before he could bring it to you. I have what he compiled." She read him the primary Cayman Islands routing number from the ledger. The account Edmund had identified as the central clearing mechanism for the weapons trafficking proceeds. The silence on the line lasted 6 seconds. Then Kell said, "Where are you?" "Not coming to your office," she said. "Tomorrow morning, Douglas Merritt is giving the keynote address at the Merritt and Holt Annual Shareholder Summit at the Emerald Tower in downtown Seattle. He will be on a public stage in front of 500 people and 24 journalists. I want you there. I want you to take him in that room in front of all of it. No quiet processing, no private surrender. Public on record in front of the cameras that are already going to be there." Kell said, "I don't take operational direction from civilians." "Then take it from Edmund Voss," she said. "He built you an airtight federal case across 11 years of solo documentation, and he's been waiting 9 years for someone to use it. The USB drive I'm bringing you has Douglas Merritt's face and voice on a 2007 recording, directing a weapons transfer and instructing a port inspector to falsify federal cargo manifests. The ledger has transaction records matching every blank in your 2011 RICO investigation. And I have a notarized witness statement from the man who filmed the 2007 recording and has been in a safe house in Eugene for a decade." She paused. "If you want to process him quietly in a back room, that's your choice. But I'll take all of this to the Seattle Times and the SEC, and the FBI looks like it had this for 11 years and couldn't close it." A longer silence. "Emerald Tower," Kell said. "Lobby at 9:30. Bring everything." She ended the call and set the burner phone on the seat beside her and drove north through the evening light toward Seattle. They stopped at a clothing store in Tacoma that was open late, and Alara paid cash for 2 suits, charcoal gray, well-cut, without being expensive, the kind of clothing that communicated that the person wearing it understood the weight of what they were walking into. Cole looked at himself in the fitting room mirror for a long moment without speaking. "Edmund never got to see this part," he said finally. "He built it," Alara said. "That's the same thing." They slept that night in a motel off the highway, clean and unremarkable, and asking no questions, and Alara lay in the dark for a long time, listening to Cole's breathing from the other bed, steady and clear in a way it hadn't been for months. And she thought about Edmund in his cabin, with his cup of coffee and his engineering manuals, and his 11 years of patient, dangerous solitary work. She thought about the photograph he had sealed into the concrete. 2 years old, both of them, their faces not yet shaped into the people they were becoming. He had put them in the wall before they were old enough to know he existed, which meant he had been thinking about them, protecting them, building toward them for their entire lives. She fell asleep with the iron key on the nightstand beside her, where she could see it if she woke in the night. The Emerald Tower in downtown Seattle rose 42 stories above 2nd Avenue, its glass facade catching the morning light in shifting patterns that made the building appear to be in constant, subtle motion. The lobby was already moving when they arrived at 9:15, staff from Merritt and Holt's corporate communications team, directing journalists to designated areas. Caterers moving through the side corridors. The particular organized energy of a major corporate event that had been planned for months and was now arriving at its moment. Kell was already there. He was standing near the center of the lobby, a tall man in his early 50s, with the build of someone who had once been in better physical shape and had let the desk work win the argument over the past decade. His suit was functional gray, and his face had the compressed, watchful quality of a person processing a great deal of incoming information without letting any of it show. Three other agents were with him, positioned around the lobby with the careful casualness of people trying not to look like what they were. Alara crossed the lobby toward him with Cole beside her, in the briefcase in her hand, and felt for the first time since November 12th of the previous year that she was walking towards something rather than away from it. Kel looked at her and she recognized in his expression the particular recalibration that happened when a person's mental image of who they were about to meet did not match the person standing in front of them. He had been expecting someone older, someone who looked more like the person you'd imagine carrying 11 years of federal evidence. She was 18 years old in a charcoal suit holding a briefcase that contained the thing he had been looking for since 2011. She handed him the briefcase. He took it to a private meeting room off the lobby, a glass-walled space normally used for corporate pre-event gatherings, and opened it on the conference table. One of his agents, young and methodical, produced a portable device and began working through the hard drives. Kel read the first 12 pages of Edmund's ledger standing up the way people read when they can't quite make themselves stop moving. After 4 minutes, the young agent looked up from the portable device and said, "Sir," then said nothing else for a moment, which told Alara everything about what he was seeing on the screen. Then he said, "It's all here. The shell company structure, the wire routing, the cargo manifests. It matches the gaps in the RICO file exactly. Every blank we couldn't fill." He looked at Kel. "And the 2007 recording is clean. Face recognition quality. Audio is partially degraded, but the key exchange is intact." Kel closed the ledger. He looked at Alara with an expression that had moved past the initial recalibration into something she didn't have an immediate word for. Something close to the recognition you extended to someone who had done a thing you understood the difficulty of. "Your grandfather," Kel said, "was the most thorough independent investigator I have never met." "He spent 11 years on it," Alara said. "He didn't leave gaps." Kel snapped the briefcase shut and looked at his team. The main ballroom of the Emerald Tower held 512 people that morning. The room was arranged in rounds with a central stage and podium, the Merritt and Holt corporate logo displayed on two large screens, flanking the stage, the company's 40-year history rendered in a brand timeline that ran along the walls in tasteful chronological panels. The audience was the specific demographic of Pacific Northwest corporate wealth: older men in expensive suits, board members and major shareholders and institutional investors who represented the financial nervous system of Douglas Merritt's empire. Alara and Cole entered from the back of the room with Kel's team distributed around them in the crowd, and she saw Douglas Merritt at the podium before he saw her. He looked exactly as he always had. The suit was charcoal and perfectly fitted, and his silver hair was exactly as it had always been. And his posture at the podium was the posture of a man entirely comfortable with being looked at by a large number of people. He was mid-speech, his voice carrying through the room's sound system, with the practiced ease of someone who had been giving speeches like this for 30 years. "We are not merely moving cargo," Douglas said, his voice resonant and unhurried. "We are moving the future. Merritt and Holt is built on a foundation of absolute integrity, on the belief that how you conduct business is as important as what your business achieves. What my father began 40 years ago, what I have spent my career honoring and extending, is a legacy of ethical leadership in an industry that does not always reward it." Alara stood at the back of the room and listened to this, and felt something very cold and very precise settle into place in the center of her chest. Then Douglas Merritt looked up from his notes, and his eyes moved across the room in the automatic survey of a speaker checking his audience, and they found her. The distance between them was 60 feet and 500 people, and it might as well have been nothing. She watched him see her, watched the specific sequence of recognition move across his face, first the simple identification, his daughter here, and then the rapid cascade of calculation as he processed what her presence meant. She was supposed to be irrelevant. She was supposed to be a loose end Sylvia Crane had handled 2 days ago in a mountain bunker. She was standing at the back of his shareholders' summit in a suit that fit her, holding nothing with her head level and her eyes steady. And the briefcase was not in her hands, which meant it was somewhere else, and somewhere else meant it was no longer containable. She watched Douglas Merritt understand that Edmund Voss had won. It took perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, his face went through more visible change than she had seen in 18 years of living under his roof. Kell moved. The agents came in from 3 directions simultaneously. The movement coordinated and unhurried in the way of people who have done this enough times that the choreography is automatic. The room registered their approach before it understood what it was, seeing the particular stillness that descends on a large group when something unexpected begins to happen in the center of their attention, and they are collectively waiting to understand it. Kell stepped up onto the stage. Douglas Merritt. His voice went through the sound system because Kell was standing close enough to the podium microphone that the room picked it up, and 500 people heard every word with perfect clarity. You are under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy to commit international arms trafficking, bribery of federal officials, and conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. The room erupted into sound. Not screaming, nothing so simple, but the massive, complicated noise of 500 people simultaneously processing something that shattered their expectations. Shock, protest, the scrape of chairs, the sound of phones being raised, journalists finding their instincts and moving toward the stage. Douglas did not move for a moment. He stood at the podium with his hands on its edges, and he looked at Kell, and then he looked at the agents coming up the stage steps from both sides, and he made the calculation that Alara had always understood. He was capable of making the cold assessment of available options and their respective costs, and he understood that there were no available options. One of the agents moved behind him and took his right arm and brought it back, and then his left, and the handcuffs produced the same sound they always produce, the small mechanical finality of a lock closing. He was turned toward the steps, and he came down them between 2 agents, and the room opened around them as they moved up the center aisle toward the exit, the crowd parting the cameras, tracking the journalists, calling questions that no one was answering. He passed within 15 feet of where Alara and Cole were standing. He looked at her. Up close, without the distance of the room or the mediation of the podium, she could see what the past 30 seconds had done to his face. The composure was still there, the bones of it, the structure built over 60 years of projecting authority and control. But underneath it, something had yielded the way a foundation yields when the load above it finally exceeds what the engineering intended. He stopped walking. The agent slowed with him, and he used the 2 seconds this bought him to look at her with an expression she recognized as something he had never directed at her before. You have nothing without the Merritt name, he said. His voice was very low. Everything you are came from what I built. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and took out the iron key and set it on the edge of the nearest table between them, in the space that separated what he had built from what Edmund had built. She said nothing. She turned away from him. Behind her, she heard Cole's voice, steady and clear, carrying without effort, in the sudden silence that had fallen in the part of the room nearest them, the words reaching the journalists whose phones were raised, and the board members whose faces had gone gray, and the 500 people who would carry this moment out of the building with them. She has everything Edmund built with his own hands, Cole said. That's more than you'll ever understand. They walked Douglas Merritt out of the Emerald Tower, through the lobby, and into the morning light of 2nd Avenue, and the cameras of the assembled press followed every step of it. What followed happened with the speed of things that have been a long time building and then arrive all at once. The SEC issued a freeze order on all Merritt and Holt assets within 48 hours of the arrest, acting on the financial documentation from Edmund's hard drives that Kell's team had processed through their own systems overnight and forwarded through the appropriate channels. The freeze was comprehensive, covering the operating accounts, the subsidiaries, the real estate holdings, and the offshore structures that the shell company documentation had made visible for the first time to federal investigators who had been trying to see through them for a decade. The board of directors held an emergency session on the day after the arrest and released a statement expressing shock and full cooperation with federal authorities and the immediate resignation of 3 members who had been named in Edmund's documentation as having received indirect benefits from the shell company structure. The statement was 4 paragraphs long and contained the word integrity twice, which Alara noted without particular feeling. Sylvia Crane was located by a Chelan County Sheriff's deputy responding to a call from the logging contractor Halverson, who had gone to check on a property in the Cascade Range after hearing about the arrest on the news and finding a Lincoln Town car parked in the mud half a mile from a gated access road. The deputy found Sylvia in the underground bunker below the cabin, dehydrated and with a significant concussion, and a great deal to say to the first law enforcement officer she had seen in 3 days, none of which ultimately benefited her legal position. She was transported to a hospital in Wenatchee and subsequently transferred to federal custody, facing charges that included attempted murder conspiracy and obstruction. Roy Callum was contacted by Kell's office and entered the Federal Witness Protection Program within the week, which he received with the specific relief of a man being released from a post he had held far longer than he had signed up for. He told the federal handler who processed his intake that he was going to buy a dog. He had always wanted a dog, and it had not been practical while staying hidden. He called Alara 2 weeks later to mention that he had found a 3-year-old retriever at the county shelter and named him Holt, which she found she appreciated more than she expected to. Birch Pruitt watched the coverage of the arrest on the television mounted above the parts counter in his garage and sat very still for a long time afterward. Then he went into the back office and found the storage box where he kept the miscellaneous items that came through the shop over the years, and he dug out the small packages he had been passed every November for 9 consecutive years by a series of different intermediaries, all of whom had given him the same instruction. Hold these for 2 kids named Voss. You'll know when to give them over. He called Alara from the garage number that evening. She picked up on the second ring. He said, "The old man who hired me to test some concrete acoustic damping material in 2009. White hair, drove a truck that was older than it needed to be." She waited. "That was Edmund," Birch said. His voice had the quality of a man fitting a piece into a picture he had been looking at for a long time. "He spent 2 days in my shop running tests on some kind of composite material. Didn't say much. Paid cash. At the end, he asked me if I had a reliable setup, and I told him yes, and he said he might have occasion to leave some items in my care at some point. I said that was fine." Birch stopped. "He was watching over you from a long way away." "Yes," Alara said. "He knew you'd end up here." She thought about that, about Edmund's calculations, the load-bearing tolerances of a plan built across decades accounting for variables that most people would have considered uncontrollable. Douglas's psychology, the legal mechanism of the codicil, the chain of custody from Roy Callum's USB drive to Kell's portable device to the arrest at the podium. The iron key sitting on a table in the Emerald Tower ballroom, placed there not as a gesture of defiance, but as a statement of accounting. "This is what was built. This is what held." "He did the math," she said. "He was an engineer." Birch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have some packages here, 9 of them. Come get them when you're ready." She drove to Tacoma 2 days later and collected them. 9 small boxes, each wrapped in plain brown paper and labeled with a year in Edmund's handwriting, 2010 through 2018. She opened them at the workbench in Birch's garage with Cole standing beside her, while Birch found reasons to be in the back office. Each one contained something small and specific. A compass in 2010 quality instrument, the kind a structural engineer would use for field work. A folding ruler in 2011, the articulated wooden type that had been standard for engineers before digital measurement. A small level in 2012. A set of precision screwdrivers in 2013, a flashlight in 2014, heavy duty the same model she had used in the bunker, a pocket knife in 2015, a pair of work gloves in 2016, a socket wrench set in 2017, and in 2018, the last year, a single envelope containing a card with no signature, just 4 words in Edmund's handwriting. "The hands are the thing." She set the card down on the workbench and looked at the 9 objects arranged in a line and understood what Edmund had been doing. He had been leaving her a toolkit. Not metaphorically, literally. Every year a tool. An engineer's tools, the things you needed to build and assess and repair and measure, given to a granddaughter he could not reach except through intermediaries and small brown packages, telling her year after year in the only language available to him that this was what mattered. That the hands were the thing and the work was the thing and everything that needed to be built could be built if you paid attention and held the line. Douglas Merritt's federal trial opened 14 months after his arrest in the Seattle federal courthouse and ran for 6 weeks. The evidence Edmund had compiled, supplemented by the digital forensic work Kell's team had done on the hard drives, and the testimony of Roy Callum delivered via video link from his new location, formed the backbone of a prosecution case that the defense team was unable to locate a meaningful seam in. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Douglas Merritt was convicted on all primary counts and sentenced to consecutive life terms in a federal facility in the eastern part of the state. He would not breathe free air again. The judge's remarks at sentencing included a specific acknowledgement of the role of Edmund Voss's documentation in bringing the case to resolution, describing it as an extraordinary act of civic commitment conducted under extraordinary personal risk over more than a decade. Alara read the remarks twice and then filed the transcript in the same box where she kept Edmund's 9 cards and the iron key and the first letter. The Voss Foundation was established 8 months after the arrest, with an initial endowment drawn from the bearer bonds and structured by a nonprofit attorney Cole had found through a legal aid organization in Portland. Its 2 primary programs were a whistleblower protection fund that provided legal and financial support to individuals at risk for reporting corporate or governmental criminal activity, and a transitional housing initiative for young people aging out of the foster system or otherwise displaced from family support structures. Cole designed the foundation's visual identity, which was simple, a compass rose rendered in a single clean line, the tool from the 2010 package. Birch Pruitt retired from the garage 18 months after the arrest, citing a knee that had been arguing with him since 2015, in which he had been losing the argument with for most of that time. The Voss Foundation purchased the garage property and converted it into a vocational training center, offering free mechanical skills instruction to people between the ages of 16 and 25. Birch ran the instruction program on Tuesdays and Thursdays and maintained convincingly to no one that this was not the same as being unretired. He showed up every week with 2 mugs of coffee already poured and a new batch of students who didn't know yet what they didn't know, and he taught them the same way he had taught Alara, by working beside them and letting them watch and saying things that were observations about the task at hand, but were also, if they were paying attention, something more than that. On a Tuesday morning in October, 14 months after they had first driven into the Cascades with a tank of gas and 2 cans of bear mace, Alara drove back to Oak Ridge alone. The road was the same, the ruts filled with early autumn rain, the Douglas firs closing over the track in their indifferent ancient way. She parked at the gate and climbed it and walked the half-mile through the forest with her breath making small clouds in the cold morning air. The cabin was as they had left it. The moss on the roof had continued its patient work. The chain on the gate had rusted another degree. The forest had moved a few inches closer on the south side. She unlocked the door with the iron key, both hands the full weight of the turn, and the same deep mechanical sound releasing in the walls. Inside, the dust had settled back to its original evenness. The mug was still on the table. The reading glasses were still on the open book. The room smelled of cold stone and old paper and kerosene, and a faint trace of something she had not noticed on the first visit, something that might have been the particular combination of soap and machine oil and paper that she had come to associate with Edmund from the objects he had left behind. She lit the lantern. She crossed to the windows and did the things she had been thinking about since they had first stood outside this building and understood what it was. She found the bolts on the interior side of the first steel shutter, 1/4-inch hex head, and she took the socket wrench from her jacket pocket, the one from the 2017 package, and she started working them loose. It took 20 minutes to get the first shutter off. It was heavier than it looked, and she had to lean it against the wall carefully. The window underneath was small and square, and its glass was dusty and filmed with years of sealed air, But when she cleaned it with the sleeve of her jacket, the light came through. It fell across the floor of the cabin in a rectangle that shifted slightly as the clouds moved outside, and it reached the table where the mug was and touched the side of the reading glasses and moved up the spines of the books on the shelf behind the armchair. And the room that had been a fortification for 11 years became in that changed light simply a room. She did the other three windows. An hour's work, the shutters stacked against the outside wall, the morning light coming in from all four directions, now finding every corner, filling the space Edmund had sealed against a danger that no longer existed. She stood in the center of the room in the light and looked at what it showed. A place where a person had lived and thought and worked and been afraid and kept working anyway. A place where an old man had made calculations about the future with the same precision he had once applied to bridge loads and soil tolerances, had built something meant to outlast him, had sealed photographs of children he could not reach into the concrete of the walls, and trusted that the structure would hold long enough for them to come and find it. She went to the mantelpiece and stood before it for a moment. Then she took the iron key from her jacket pocket and set it in the center of the mantelpiece, in the place that had been empty since Edmund had last stood here, and taken it down to prepare it for the envelope he would leave with his attorney. She stepped back and looked at it. The key sat on the old fir beam in the morning light, dark and heavy and cold. Exactly what it was, a piece of iron cut to open one specific lock, built to last, designed by an engineer who understood that the things worth building were the things it held. She pulled Edmund's chair to the window and sat down in it and looked out at the forest, the old trees standing in the October light, their upper canopy moving in a wind she couldn't feel from inside. She thought about bridges, about how a bridge worked, not because of any single component, but because of the relationship between components, the way load was transferred and distributed and carried, the way a thing that looked static was always in a condition of active balance, always holding against the forces acting on it, every moment requiring the structure to do what it was built to do. Edmund had built something like that. Not in steel and concrete only, though he had built that too, but in time and patience and the accumulated weight of 11 years of choosing to keep working when the work was invisible and the outcome was uncertain, and the man he was building against had every institutional advantage available. She thought about Cole at the workbench in Birch's garage opening 9 small packages. She thought about Roy Callum sleeping soundly for the first time in 11 years with a retriever named Holt on the foot of the bed. She thought about Kell reading Edmund's ledger standing up because he couldn't quite make himself stop. She thought about the iron key on the mantelpiece and the way the morning light moved across it as the clouds shifted outside, and she thought that this was what it meant to build something that held. Not that the danger never came, not that the weight was never more than you had expected, but that the structure stood, that the calculations had been right, that when the moment arrived that the thing was meant for it was ready. The forest outside the window went on doing what it had always done, indifferent and ancient and entirely reliable. And Alara Voss sat in her grandfather's chair in the light that was coming through the windows for the first time in 11 years, and she let the morning be quiet.